Mark Greendorfer is an attorney at the Tri-Valley Law Firm, and he is the co-founder and president of the Zachor Legal Institute. Mark has done a significant amount of work mapping out the potential violations of U.S. federal and state laws, including anti-terrorism and anti-racketeering laws, that the entities and individuals funding and overseeing BDS activity, or boycott, divestment, and sanctions activity against Israel in the United States, may be subject to. Mark, thank you for joining us from sunny California today.
Thank you. Pleasure to be on.
Thank you. So tell me, how did you get into this area in the first place? How did you get to the point where you submitted a very well thought out and argued letter to the Department of Justice calling for the investigation of what you call certain domestic affiliates of foreign terror organizations that are operating here in the United States and are influencing, if not organizing or behind, the so-called BDS movement?
Well, it started when we were first drafting one of our original law review articles on BDS under federal law generally. And we were looking for federal laws that they may be violating. And at that time, it was around 2016, Dr. Jonathan Schanzer was going before the House, and he laid out in testimony ties between Hamas promoters and BDS promoters. And at that point, we realized that this was a classic RICO conspiracy. And we then started digging deeper into the law, trying to figure out what the elements of RICO are that would apply to BDS, who the BDS operatives would be that we'd ask for prosecution, and who they were tied to in terms of foreign terror organization. So that took about a year worth of research and writing to come up with the letter that you referenced that we sent to the DOJ around July of this year.
Right. And so tell me, what is a RICO violation?
Okay, RICO violation, it usually comprises several elements. One is you have to have a group of people. The classic example is the mafia, where you had the five families in New York City and otherwise, where they were a shadowy organization. We all knew that they had a common goal, but they hid it well enough that they weren't subject to prosecution as an entire entity, that you could pick off lower level people, but you couldn't get the entire organization and thus take down the head of the snake. So the elements of the RICO prosecution that we're looking at here is, we know that there's a group of people. It's BDS activists, and generally it's Students for Justice in Palestine, American Muslims for Palestine, Muslim Students Association, and a group called Dream Defenders out of Florida. We believe that they act in a coordinated fashion at the behest of designated terror organizations, usually Hamas, PFLP, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, to advance the nonviolent attacks on Israel using boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. And so the specific predicate, under RICO, you have to have what's called a predicate crime, and it could be anything from extortion to providing material support to terrorism as part of the Patriot Act after 9/11. And that is what we're alleging, is that by doing the legwork for Hamas, Hezbollah, PFLP, et cetera, these BDS groups are in effect providing them with the material support that they need to spread the war against Israel into the United States, and especially on U.S. campuses.
So
and we also believe that there's two ways that this goes, that they're also, we think that they're receiving funding from the offshore terrorist groups as well.
Okay, so just to boil this down, we're talking about groups like American Muslims for Palestine, Students for Justice in Palestine, the Muslim Students Association. These are groups that are very active on U.S. college campuses. What would you say is the mandate of these groups? How are they operating to achieve the goals of foreign terrorist organizations? And then what tangible evidence do we have of the relationship between these designated terrorist groups and these particular groups that I just mentioned?
I'll go to the second question first, and that is that if you look at, for example, how an organization like Dream Defenders has actively cooperated with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. They send delegations to where PFLP headquarters are in the territories administered by Israel, and they then, in exchange, these Dream Defenders put into schools curricula that promote anti-Israel sentiment. And that goes to your first question. Their goal is the same goal as the Arab League and as many, as Hamas, Hezbollah. It's to destroy Israel. What we found is that there are significant sort of carryover ties between the old Arab League boycott of Israel and the BDS movement. And if you remember what the Arab League boycott was all about, it was the Arab League's way, when they couldn't win militarily, to weaken Israel financially to the point that they could simply exterminate the Jewish state. That agenda is what we believe BDS's agenda is. And actually, if you look through some of their materials, they set out sort of a guideline of their organizing document, and it says that very explicitly. And just recently, I think it was a Muslim Students Association, or AMP group, that was on campus, and they specifically said, we believe that Israel is an apartheid state and should be eliminated.
Right. So those who say, well, this is free speech, your retort to that is, well, actually, when you provide material support to a designated terrorist group, it's without the element of protected speech. And now we're talking about potential criminal behavior. And so this group, Dream Defenders, which, by the way, I believe Linda Sarsour is on the board of, is organizing trips for people, delegations to go meet with PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. This is what you're alleging, which is a designated terrorist group, and then coming back and implementing the goals and strategies that they potentially discussed. How about this group, American Muslims for Palestine? Who are they? What are their connections to nefarious groups?
It's a very similar connection. These groups, and I apologize, one of them was founded by CARE, and I believe that it's AMP. And CARE is the organization that also was an unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation case that found that Americans were funneling money to Hamas. So these are all groups that nominally are religious groups or cultural groups, but they all have the same. I don't think that I've ever seen MSA or AMP do anything other than attack Israel. So who are they? I believe that they're just the alter ego of the foreign terror organizations offshore that are pulling the strings.
So when you say alter ego, though, are there finances that are flowing from foreign organizations to AMP and then being distributed here within the United States? Materials are created for student groups. My understanding from, I think it was Jonathan Shanzer's testimony before Congress on the issue, is that AMP also provides materials for students to use to advocate on campus. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. They use Twitter to forward PFLP material to their followers, and they
actual
also create
PFLP material, actual Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine material.
Yeah, they don't even hide it. It's just it's not even really a repackaging. They simply take it and they put it on their on their course materials. For example, when they go to schools, and they give credit to the PFLP.
How about the money? Is money coming from top down?
That's something that we believe there has to be, but this is actually why we've gone to the Department of Justice and asked for an investigation, because when it comes to money, there are many ways to hide the movement of money internationally. And, we as a legal foundation, private parties can't really get that kind of information. Only the government, with its powers of subpoena and document production, et cetera, can dig in and find that. Now, speaking of Dr. Shanzer, he actually testified twice to Congress, and in the second bit of testimony later in the year, he identified the PLO as been running a war room, I believe, in Europe, where they are providing funding to BDS groups. So I'm not sure where he got that information from, but I believe it's absolutely the case. There's no other way that they could have the resources that they have without getting money from foreign sources.
And after all, these are the same people who were behind the Holy Land Foundation, which was taken down for providing material support for Hamas. My understanding is that some of the same people who were working at Holy Land Foundation went and opened up other organizations, including American Muslims for Palestine. What did they learn then from their experience at Holy Land Foundation, perhaps how to conceal their activities and so forth?
I think that that's what they learned, is conceal your activities. Don't make it as obvious as the Holy Land folks did. Make sure that you, especially with regard to the financial movements, make sure that it goes through intermediaries and that it's cloaked well enough that only, that nobody really could find it outside of somebody with the government powers of subpoenas and warrants.
Mm-hmm. And so, would you say that there's any truth to the claim that this boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is grassroots, that it's a student-led initiative by well-meaning people who want to advocate for human rights in the Palestinian context? Is there a more sinister top-down approach here?
It's much more sinister. If you go back through the history of BDS, it was formed around the time of the September 11th attacks, when there were certain conferences allegedly taking place in Africa and elsewhere to combat racism and discrimination. And those were taken over by radical groups that were promoting an anti-Israel agenda. So those groups included Iran and some of the more notorious terrorist groups like Hezbollah, and they created BDS. They stepped away from it after a while because it then became something that looks like a grassroots organization. But if you look at still today, the BDS governing body is comprised of 5 different terrorist organizations, including Hamas and the PLO and PFLP. So they
Wait a minute. Step back. So the actual organization, what is the name of the organization? This is BNC that you're talking about, right? What does the acronym stand for?
The BDS National Committee.
The BDS National Committee on its board has designated terrorist groups, and AMP is associated with BNC? It's a member of BNC?
Well, AMP takes its marching orders from BNC. I mean, because the BNC sets out the worldwide agenda for BDS. And so, they have hidden their connections to other organizations, but it's very clear that they all adhere to the same BDS call. They'll even say that BDS sprung up from Palestinian civil society. That's actually 100% false. If you look at the BNC website, they'll tell you that they have terrorist organizations at their foundation.
They openly advertise this. So what is the DOJ, the Department of Justice, waiting for? You submitted this letter. What can we do to assist law enforcement? Has there been any indication from law enforcement that they're going to be looking into this? I mean, your memo shows all these organizations with pretty direct connections to terrorist groups, and your RICO case as well, they're taking their marching orders from BNC, which openly advertises its affiliation with designated terrorist groups. Why isn't law enforcement doing anything here?
I think that in large part they have, in general, a backlog at the Department of Justice. So it takes time for them to get to this. And second, they need political pressure to let them know that many people, including politicians who represent, in Senate and the House, want this investigation to start. It's the question is a great question because Dr. Schanzer's testimony has been before Congress now for 2 years, I believe. It laid out the case. It laid out the evidentiary case for what the RICO letter is alleging. And you would think that at some point, Congress would have said to the Department of Justice, what's going on with this? As far as I know, they're not. So we need them to be motivated to ask this question.
Obviously, the Jewish community should start speaking out against this issue and using their influence to get law enforcement to look into it. This is a national security issue. This is about the radicalization of our students on campus, and allegedly this radicalization being directed by designated terrorist groups. Unbelievable. Mark, thank you so much for your incredible work, and we support you, we support what you're doing, and thank you for your time coming on today.
Thank you, I appreciate it.